Next, our second session is about to start. In fact, it has started. Let me briefly introduce myself. Simon Smith is my name. I'm chair of the steering group for the Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House. And I'm joined by four brilliant experts who will spend the next hour and a quarter or so discussing with you the question of Ukraine's reconstruction. I have Olena Bilan, who is the chief economist and head of research at Dragon Capital. I have John Luff, associate fellow of Chatham House on the Russia and Eurasia program. I have Orysia Lutsevich, who is the head of the Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House. And I have Katerina Volchuk, professor of politics at Birmingham University and also an associate fellow here at Chatham House. Now, our session is about Ukraine's reconstruction, and there may be some in the audience today and some online who are asking themselves, wait a minute, the destruction of Ukraine continues at an alarming and distressing rate. Why are we here talking about reconstruction? There will be others, and I hope quite a lot of people, who'll be saying it makes every sense that we should be talking, if we have not already, and we have already started talking about reconstruction, then we ought to get on with it right now, because a plan for, or many plans for Ukraine's reconstruction are essential, and it makes absolutely no sense for any of those countries supporting Ukraine, for Ukraine and for Ukrainians not to be thinking ahead about what the task of reconstruction will entail, including how much it is going to cost, how much needs reconstructing, and what is going to get in the way of reconstruction and what is going to help it. So broadly speaking, we will look at those themes, at those questions, with your help from excellent questions from the floor, no doubt, over the next 75 minutes or so. And I'm going to go along the panel in the order in which you see people, asking our panelists to make a few, share a few introductory thoughts with us. And I'm going to start with Olena, to ask you, Olena, for some kind of a sort of snapshot overview of the scale of damage so far inflicted on Ukraine. And I think, broadly speaking, even that one would divide into a number of parts. But I think in a big picture sense, we're talking obviously about physical infrastructural damage. What is the scale of that damage? What is it going to take to repair it? But I think we're also looking at a deeper question of how much fundamental systemic damage may have been done to the Ukrainian economy. How handicapped is Ukraine going to be at whatever stage the war finishes in putting itself back into a state of economic health? So with those two, Olena, it's my pleasure to ask you to kick us off.
Thank you, Simon. Indeed, so that the war hit Ukraine's economy very hard. So far, the estimate that we have for the real GDP decline is 30%, but it will be worse because Russia started targeting Ukraine's power infrastructure with missile attacks, and that would further depress economic activity in the country. So at the moment, we expect the decline, full year decline in real GDP this year to worsen to 32%. But again, it's not the end of the story. Most likely next year, there will be no even small growth. So there will be another year of economic decline. So we now expect 5%, but well, the situation is very fluid. The fiscal situation is also very tough. Ukraine runs a huge budget deficit of 27% of GDP. So nearly 30% of GDP is a budget deficit. Unemployment is also very high. Well, there are no kind of numbers, official numbers, but they are estimated by the central bank, and it's also close to 30%. So basically, any number you can think, it's about 30% damage, right? So 30% of our economy just gone. But at the same time, I must admit that Ukraine's economy is doing well in these circumstances, thanks to professional reaction of the central bank and the government from the very beginning of the war. We have the banking system fully operational, no deposit run, no panic. We have the central bank reserves actually close to pre-war level. Yeah. Our post office, our railway is functioning, so and there are no delays in trains. Yes, which is
Come to Ukraine.
Yeah, I know the problems are acute here. But literally, yes, the only exception is when there is a missile attack. So definitely trace are delayed, but it's kind of couple of hours, let's say. And internet is much better as well. That's for sure. Yeah, so but this is because actually we have the whole society very much united, and supportive to the government and really ready to fight and defend the country on all fronts, on military front and on economic front as well. So turning to the question of physical damages. So of course, at the moment, there are only kind of very rough estimates. And I think the most comprehensive studies that have been done so far is by the World Bank and by the Kiev School of Economics. So both assess damages in a little bit different methodologies. The World Bank estimated that the damages to fixed assets were at $100 billion US. But this was an estimate as of 1st of June of this year. Now, as more damages were incurred, so the latest estimate from the Kiev School of Economics is nearly 130 billion. That's by the beginning of September. So like 3 months of damages is another 30 billion, 3 months of war, another $30 billion of damages. This estimate is based on the so-called kind of replacement costs. Definitely the reconstruction needs will be much higher. And what the World Bank estimated in June was 350 billion. So probably over time, most likely over time, this number will be growing. So actually, that's probably an unprecedented scale of damages and the reconstruction needs that we will face. I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you very much, Ale. Can I just ask perhaps one short follow-up question? Do you have a sense of, in looking at those dimensions of costs that need to be met, do you have a sense of where the expectation is in terms of the balance of private investment, of private capital, and of what will be expected of other governments supporting Ukraine, what will be expected of international organizations and so on?
Yeah, thanks for this follow-up question. One point that I want to make, that actually currently the UK, our other allies do support Ukraine tremendously. We were very grateful for this support. The two main direction is that military support and the direct budget support. And the second part is closer to my kind of everyday activities. Yeah. And so far for this year, this direct budget support will amount to $32 billion US. And next year, it will likely be higher, about $40 billion US. So that our allies already spent a lot of money to help Ukraine kind of go through all these challenges. And then after all these numbers, yeah, that come on top of military support, we are talking about 350 billion of reconstruction needs. Where should the money come from? And I think that there should be two key sources. One is private sector money, so that we already now can kind of encourage or get prepared for the private sector to invest in Ukraine after the war. And then it will be very profitable. The country will be growing like on a double-digit scale. And the second and very important why we are talking about reconstruction now is we all have to make Russia pay for what they did. And we have to start preparing now because it will be a lengthy process. I know some people will be skeptical about this, but we should think out of the box. Right? It's a war in the middle of Europe. And all these arguments that, okay, we cannot take Russia's assets because, it's property, right, protection, will be negative impact on financial markets. We have to find a solution because it's not you, not the taxpayers of the UK or other countries that have to pay for this. It's Russia who has to pay for this.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think you're almost certainly right to anticipate that there will be perhaps some skepticism also amongst our audience as to how exactly the reparations thing will work. And perhaps we will come back to that later in the discussion. But just to focus on your other point there about the importance of private investment, I think that leads very, very neatly on to John Luff, because John, you've done a lot of work looking at the varying levels of success with which Ukraine has grabbed the imagination and enthusiasm of private investors. You've looked at various kind of weaknesses and opportunities in Ukraine over the years and so on. So very interested in hearing from you what you see as the real challenge to mobilize that commitment of support to the reconstruction effort in Ukraine.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see this session so well attended. I'm going to start, if I may, with some basic points before we get to the questions that you've answered, Simon, because I think they need to be put into perspective. It seems to me that if this war ends on terms advantageous to Ukraine, the country is going to have an extraordinary opportunity to not just rebuild its damaged infrastructure, but in fact to transform its economy. There's no shortage of entrepreneurial and innovative people in Ukraine. We're seeing this at the moment with the right support in the right conditions. Ukraine should be capable of rebuilding very fast. So these comparisons that people make with Afghanistan, Bosnia, and Iraq, they are entirely inappropriate. Ukraine, in short, has plenty of capacity to create wealth, and we're already seeing in some cases new transportation links being built to the European market. Ukraine is going to become much more deeply integrated with the EU, and of course, at some point may even become a member. We should also point out that Ukraine is already rebuilding, and rebuilding, I think, very effectively. You look at the way roads are being rebuilt, bridges, the way the power grid is being restored after being attacked. Quite amazing. My sort of second basic point is that the foundation for Ukraine's effective reconstruction is not just institutions. The country's external security must be guaranteed, because otherwise the investment, and particularly the private sector investment, is simply not going to arrive. And I think the reconstruction discussion doesn't focus on this element, in my view, sufficiently. It's so much easier somehow to talk about the history of the deficiencies of governance in Ukraine rather than the kind of the hard issues. So if Ukraine, as we all hope, succeeds in restoring its territorial integrity, then we will have a responsibility to provide Ukraine with the strongest security guarantees possible. The funding from Western governments for the reconstruction of Ukraine will, in my view, simply kickstart the reconstruction process. The bulk of the expenditure will be covered by investment from the private sector. The Ukrainian government and civil society, it seems to me, understand this point very well. They recognize the country is going to have to expand its systems for ensuring transparency and accountability to create those incentives for external parties to invest. And there is, in fact, a lot to build on. A lot was achieved after 2014 in terms of closing down the space for many of the old corrupt practices. If we hadn't had the decentralization reforms, then it's unlikely we would have seen this degree of resilience at the moment that Ukraine has shown. The absolutely crucial issue is judicial reform, and that's one of the hardest nuts to crack. So if one thinks about the institutional challenge in Ukraine, there's absolutely no doubt, and I've written about this extensively, that Ukraine has a peculiar system, which I have just called Sistema for short. It's this particularly resilient system of informal decision-making. Some people call it shadow governance. And effectively, a narrow set of powerful interests were able to disregard the greater public good. They were able to game the country's institutions for their own purposes and their own benefit. When this war comes to an end, my view is that Ukraine is going to have an unprecedented opportunity to slay this system. As new business groups emerge, whose motivation is not to strip value from the state, but rather to create value. Politics, as a result, is likely to undergo deep and rapid change, and hopefully freeing itself from the control of the old financial industrial groups. And then you would have the possibility of politics becoming more diverse, more competitive, and indeed more representative of society's interests. As far as the famous corruption challenge goes, it seems to me when the war comes to an end, we must not allow Reconstruction to increase the problem of corruption. That goes without saying. Corruption prevention rather than punishment will be the key. And here, for practical reasons, the corruption prevention program since the start of the war has suffered. We've had the suspension of the verification of asset declarations. I mean, all for good reason, because you can't do this sort of thing during war. And then, the accelerated procedures for awarding state contracts, which happen in moments of crisis. And for goodness sake, we saw this in the United Kingdom during COVID and the way contracts were awarded. But the anti-corruption institutions established after 2014 are continuing to function. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, continues to work well. The High Anti-Corruption Court is still there. But judicial reform for me still remains the toughest nut to crack. And it's not just that the judiciary needs new governing bodies, it requires substantial renewal as a whole, and it has to grow a culture of independence. And I think for that to happen, the political environment has to change. But the political environment will change when this war comes to an end. If I may, just a last point, the place of the armed forces and the security services in post-war Ukraine will be, I think, an obvious concern. Because in wartime, these organizations, of course, have a vastly increased role in decision-making and the setting of national priorities. So there is going to be a challenge to, if you like, re-civilianize decision-making. But I think that's a perfectly normal thing to happen in the aftermath of a war. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. And once again, you provided a perfect segue to our next expert, because when you talk about the kind of societal changes, governmental changes that need to keep happening in Ukraine, I think, again, one very important question for the success of a reconstruction effort has got to be what is going to be the nature and extent of engagement of Ukraine's population with it. I think there will be a huge expectation in Ukraine that this must be something that is in which civil society has a huge role to play. I see Ukraine as a place where progressively the demand for really genuine kind of buy-in on behalf of citizens has only just kept on increasing over the years. So that again is part of the environment in which any reconstruction program is going to be launched. So Aristia, you've been doing a lot of work on thinking about these things. What are your thoughts on the in a sense, the societal environment, which will need to be the basis on which reconstruction is carried out.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. And I'm really pleased that Olena brought in that example of resilience, that Ukraine still functions, that, you know, banking is working, communication is working. And there's been a lot of, you know, wonder in the West. How is that possible with such weak governance, with such corrupt institution, with such bad image Ukraine had over the years? And I would say that very much strong civil society and those reforms that took place after the revolution of dignity, right? This was a real trigger for change in Ukraine. And those changes, what they've done, they basically made citizens co-governors at various levels to a various degree of Ukraine. It's very much collaborative governance. And civil society in Ukraine is very much not just a watchdog, but a sledgedog. It was always on the forefront pushing the agenda. And that famous reform sandwich where there was Western conditionality and Ukrainian pressure from civil society, but not only pressure, but also design of reforms, decentralization, anti-corruption, was very much, there was very much strong ownership. And of course, legitimacy, and that what helps sustain resilience in times of crisis and war is that local mayors, because of thanks to decentralization, have trust. People know that they are here to serve them, not to enrich themselves. And finally, what was fundamental, I think, throughout those years from 2014 is transparency and digitalization. So you have a good mix in Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine in a different way. I think that Ukrainian civil society is very progressive in that way. So when there are talks about these, even in times of war, when you think about it, it is already participating and rebuilding and developing and redeveloping Ukraine. So we have public opinion polling that 80% of Ukrainians, from a colleague of Democratic Initiatives Foundation that spoke up previously, already are contributing to war effort. And when you ask people, why are you doing it? What is the emotion that urges you to do it? They say it's basically hope that they are partaking in the war effort in resistance, and also 60% say that they've solved a problem. So here, I think it's very much speaks to the fact that Ukrainian civil society is an agent, not just the beneficiary of civil state services or assistance. That is why I think we need to embed it deeply into the future of rebuilding. It cannot be just watching on the side or being a beneficiary. And I'd like to share a couple of slides. We actually ran ahead of this conference. If I can ask, please, the technical team. What we've asked Ukrainian non-profit organizations, and we've collected over 173 responses from over 500 groups that we've shared it. What are the priorities for reconstruction? And look at the number one priority. It's modernization of state institutions. You very strong agenda by national-based organizations, a little bit less in the region. And then, of course, it's rebuilding of physical infrastructure. Green agenda is there, creating conditions for return of Ukrainians that live abroad. And that actually means for the modernization of state institutions that there will be a strong push for rule of law, and there will be a strong push for EU membership, making sure Ukraine delivers on those promises, 7 steps that EU Commission presented to open accession negotiations. If we put the next slide, it's quite interesting. What are the top risks they see? And you see as much as here, it's embezzlement of funds, it's risk of corruption. I'm really pleased that there's such high awareness of that risk. And risk number 2 is creation of new vested interests, something that John spoke to. Because as war continues, we see new nationalization efforts. For example, one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, Kolomoisky, his assets were taken over by the state. Ukrainian State Property Fund will own a lot of assets after at the end of the war, and we need to have new privatization. So that means some funds will be raised to rebuild Ukraine from that sales. But also look at the fear of capacity. This is something that happens during the war, is people are fleeing, people are dying, a lot of men are now fighting, women are taking a lot of pressure. We have to think about how do we nurture Ukrainian capacity of state and regional authorities to efficiently implement projects. And slide number 3 is actually where does civil society see its added value? And I think it could really be a strong partner. Anti-corruption watchdog, people are there watching. They will be at the back of local and national governments to make sure funds are spent properly. And an interesting fact is that social cohesion and resilience. And I would like to speak to that because as we see, active citizenship allows you to be hopeful about the future. And we want to make sure that citizens are engaged in the consensus building in their communities. It will be very difficult because there will be conflicting priorities. One part of community will want to build a new stadium, another one the new bridge. You need to ensure that you train people and there are mediums for that conflict resolution policy making. It's important here, it's important in the post-war society, it's important now. And I'm really pleased that Ukrainian civil society is so mature. They see this as an added value to democracy. So overall, I think we need to have a deliberate design to make sure Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian private sector, which also speaks a lot, is integral part of recovery. And that could be done through, at this point, I would say it's not satisfactory because we see a lot of different bubbles discussing recovery, but the state is doing it a bit, in its own bubble. But enlarging, for example, National Recovery Council, including local NGOs into community planning of future rebuilding, subcontracting services. Look, they are prepared to do it, assisting in service delivery. 40% of regional NGOs are ready to sell their services and help groups that are needed. Funders also should make it conditional that these instruments must be included in recovery. And I think overall, we'll see a good success. I'm really hopeful because this is the agenda that is not coming from Chatham House. It's not coming from external experts. It's coming from Ukrainian civil society. So that gives me hope.
Thank you, Orysia. And it's no accident your last word is hope, because so often listening to you, I think one goes away filled with a little bit more hope than when one started. I think there's a couple of issues that I'd like to come back to perhaps later on in the discussion, particularly on the kind of political environment we might see in Ukraine. But I think let's pass on straight away to Katerina to talk to us a little bit, first of all, about the role of the European Union, perhaps in where it fits in, how influential it can be, how ready it is to engage on reconstruction, and maybe even widen that out to say, let's hear your assessment of how ready is the international community with far-seeing and effectively developed plans for reconstructing Ukraine.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And perhaps I'll just start with linking to the previous session and already what has been mentioned here as well. The destruction of infrastructure and targeting civilian targets, critical infrastructure, is not just to dissuade Ukraine from opposing, but it's also to raise the bill for the West, to dissuade the West. And we are sort of going in a kind of war taxi when we're trying to avoid bombs and the meter is clocking all the time. And the longer we go on, the larger the bill is going to be, and it's a moving target. It's effectively almost, we know it's going to be high, but how high, it also depends on the scale of our ambitions, what we mean by reconstruction. And reconstruction is, in a way, a catch-all concept, that it sort of spans several sort of different aspects, and it's a moving target, because we are talking about relief, through macroeconomic assistance and budget support. Then we can talk about reconstruction, modernization, and accession to the EU. And just to give you an example, let's say in Bucha, there is a part where gas pipelines are destroyed. Are we just going to rebuild the destroyed section, or are we going to use it to renovate the whole, basically, pipeline network? Those are the questions which people, basically, we need that sort of diagnostic tools for assessing the needs. This already exists, which is very good due to decentralization, but the task is enormous. And from that point of view, it's not only a moving target, but the scale of it is unprecedented. And Ukraine, in a way, opens so many Pandora boxes that we looked at them in a compartmentalized way, like food security. Then sort of now we are talking about a war crime tribunal, international war crime tribunal. There is no one model that we can use when it comes to basically the architecture, how to structure reconstruction, because the scale is unprecedented, but also the complexity. We have lots of sort of pledges and declarations, big sums are being mentioned. The challenge is how to create the infrastructure, architecture to actually manage this. And it's not only because international donors, this is a classic case of basically international assistance. Even when it is well integrated or relatively well integrated in Afghanistan, it doesn't guarantee that it's going to be effective. So we're very lucky to have Afghanistan as a sort of case, how not to do things. But the fact is that there is no off-the-shelf architecture. We have lots of international donors coming, declaring, but actually release. And when it comes to relief and humanitarian assistance versus long-term planning for reconstruction and modernization, that's a different kettle of fish. So where is the EU? Where is the EU on this? This is an interesting story because Ukraine opened all the Pandora boxes that the EU wouldn't like to open otherwise. And one of them is the issue of membership. Ukraine was granted the candidate status in an unprecedented act of symbolic solidarity. So a tectonic shift from that point of view, but it was at the political level. The machinery, we actually are in a kind of twilight zone between neighborhood and sort of enlargement, because many member states, although they agreed they have to do, apparently Scholz still didn't know what to do with Ukraine when he was boarding the train to Kyiv. That decision was made there. But so adopting a wait and see, and regarding the candidate status as a sort of peak of solidarity, high point of solidarity, the same way that the Western Balkans were offered the membership perspective, but it proved largely inconsequential for the actual integration with the EU. So this, Ukraine opens that debate, but also opens the debate, this is related issue, how it should be, how the architecture for reconstruction should be managed. Life is never perfect. It's always about long-term planning, and the financial perspective in the EU. For the time being, Ukraine is in the neighborhood portfolio. In 5 years' time, it can be migrated. We are dealing with ad hoc pledges and allocation from the EU, which is highly politicized, and as we know, can be blocked by individual member states, as happened with this 18 billion euro pledge. So this is a challenge already, because it's a sort of architecture with many moving parts. There is an issue of basic partnership with the US. We know there's a lot of resentment from the US about the EU not living up to basically the expectations, especially when it comes to military aid. So there is an sort of informal understanding that EU will lead the basic reconstruction effort. But we also need a single center. And it's very interesting that people who actually work on reconstruction around the world, and including people from the Marshall Plan, German Marshall Plan, have actually said we need a single, strong decision center, which can bang heads if needed to make sure that we speak with a single voice and we are a credible interlocutor. The worst thing that could happen is this donor competition when donors go to different Ukrainian institutions and offering basically assistance. So there are various ideas. The worst idea, or perhaps name and shame, the worst idea is to have this regional allocation of donors, that they adopt an oblast, a region of Ukraine, and they actually develop it. We will end up with Australian motorways, and then sort of across the border will have German motorways and lighting system and maintenance and everything else. So there are lots of sort of other issues, but I'll just flag up 2 more points if I can still. One is dealing with cohesion and avoiding inequalities. At the moment, what we have is almost this ad hoc rebuilding in assistance, a humanitarian assistance, but it means some areas get more than others. And it is very often that people from lower social economic background stayed basically in villages and cities which were then occupied and destroyed. And there is a real, if we have no concerted, integrated, systematic effort, the actually ad hoc assistance will exacerbate inequalities. The second caveat, we talk about integration into the single market. This is vital, going back to John's point, because European integration is not just about ideas, it's about economic interest. And we want European investors to go to Ukraine. But the challenge is, basically, European value chains, they really favor basically this closer proximity. They work with distance. The closer to the border is better. In the case of Ukraine, this is Western Ukraine, which is likely to attract most investment. But the greatest damage and destruction is in the east and south. So what we need is also, sorry, it's like a wish list. I'm trying to be positive, John, here. In terms of actually having better infrastructure so we can reach the regions which have been most affected. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Katarina. Again, you touched right at the end there on, I think, a very big, general, fundamental question, which I'm interested in hearing views from all or any of you on, which is this question of, do we actually need here the one big master plan? Do we need a sort of overarching initiative which ensures that the kind of coordination you're talking about, or the kind of avoidance of ad hocery that you've talked about, is nailed into the plan for reconstruction? Or is it actually, does experience tell us that it's actually unrealistic to in a sense, get buy-in to the one overall master plan, and that a more pragmatic or more realistic approach is simply to put emphasis on the kind of sort of responsible, eyes open coordination that you talk about? I mean, coordination of a cooperation effort, it often gets a very bad name because it often, in lots of environments, it doesn't work particularly well. And you've talked about the dangers of donor competition and that kind of thing. It crops up far too often. But is it credible to think, and is it sensible to wish for a big overall master plan? And if so, where is that going to come from? Any of you?
Say a few words because I've attended 2 reconstruction conferences, so I feel obliged to share what I've seen there. I was in Lugano this summer, and then in the Berlin high-level expert conference convened by Olaf Scholz and Ursula von der Leyen. From what I got from these meetings, first in Lugano, Ukrainian government presented the National Recovery Plan. It's basically a utopia, you can say, or a plan about how Ukraine will look like, what kind of resources are needed. And this is a blueprint very much of a competitive European, green, progressive, open economy that would attract investors that will be part of the European market. And that was good. It seemed like it had all the right words, including all the principles. And then there was a conference in Berlin where everybody exactly understood that there's no clarity on the delivery engine, and there has been no progress between summer and fall in designing it. And it looks like between now and some time, the recovery funds will be delivered through existing mechanisms, IFIs, World Bank, EBRD, European Investment Bank, as much as possible. But again, there was a very strong emphasis on the need for coordination. So they've agreed to a financial Rammstein. We'll see if there will be a meeting of finance ministers mainly was needed at the EU level to raise those 18 billion that Ursula von der Leyen promised will be delivered to Ukraine next year. So it's a very slow process, it's a very political process. And at this point, the decision is to use as much existing facilities that there are in order for Ukraine to stand on its feet.
Thank you. I think if, yeah, please do.
Well, the answer to your question from my side probably would be we do need a master plan. But we also need to give freedom to the private sector. So the private sector can decide better where it sees opportunities. But actually the private sector in Ukraine did not incur a lot of damages to fixed assets. And there were a lot of economic losses. So of course that many companies lost revenues, you know, that there is very low demand for their products, export is blocked, that's clear. But in terms of physical damages, there is not that much that needs to be reconstructed and rebuilt. But what is need to be rebuilt is housing. Of that $130 billion of damages, 40% is housing. And it's mostly in the areas in the east. So in the north of Ukraine, which was occupied until April, and in the east and south, which is still occupied. The second biggest item, 30% of the total, is road infrastructure. So of course, there should be a master plan. What needs to be rebuilt first to enable, you know, businesses to run, to enable people to return. And I think that's, again, another important point why we talk about reconstruction now, that it's better to coordinate it now and not to wait until the war is over.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now turn to the point where I invite questions, but I'm going to slightly reverse the order and take a question from my screen, first of all, because it touches on part of what you were saying, Olena, about private sector role in reconstruction. And it's a question from Orla McBreen of the Embassy of Ireland, who asks, is it over-optimistic to think that the private sector will be happy to invest significantly in reconstruction of non-profit-making civilian infrastructure in sectors like education and health? So how are we going to deal with that if the private sector, it doesn't look attractive to them?
Again, my answer to this would be the private sector will invest where it sees an opportunity to earn profit. So we are not talking about the schools, we are not talking about hospitals. That will be rebuilt with other sources. And as I mentioned, the main source of funding should be Russia's assets. Well, we will definitely welcome any help from the governments, from the partner governments, but I really doubt that they have resources to finance it.
Right, thank you. Let's go for questions. Let's start here, madam.
Thank you very much. Veronika Movchan, Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting, Kyiv, Ukraine. And actually, it echoes the last discussion because the precondition for successful restructuring is security. And I also agree that the private funds should play the role. At least it's much easier than just have donor financed reconstruction, which will require huge coordination, huge reporting, and can be difficult as that. But security is the issue for private and basically public funds, but for private, definitely. Would first, probably more like non-economic fashion, how you see the preconditions for security, how you see security guarantees? Would just reaching the Ukrainian borders of 1991 be sufficient as the security guarantee, or as our previous panel discussion showed, Russia will not change? It's very unlikely to change. It might, but unlikely. So how would you see security guarantees in this case? And second, probably to Olena, would multi-donor fund help, insurance fund help to attract investments? Would it allow to cover the gap? And if yes, how much would you expect to attract to this fund?
Let's park on that question because I want to bring John in on the question of security and security guarantees. And I think what we're talking about here is not just what would a security guarantee in the context of an eventual settlement of the conflict look like, but what is the security of the environment in which private investment is expected to engage in Ukraine, and what possibly can be done to increase that degree of security of investment?
Okay, well, there are two aspects to this question. My personal view is that we will not have any other option than to bring Ukraine into NATO. And I can hardly believe that I'm saying that, because I didn't think that was ever going to be possible. But I just see no other way of doing it to ensure that Russia is sufficiently constrained. We are going to have to deter Russia in the future in the most effective fashion. At the same time, private sector investors are going to be looking at the quality of the investment environment. They are going to want to see improvement in terms of the functioning of institutions. The regulators, for example, are certainly areas where I think improvement can be achieved. But more generally in the economy, I think investors will be looking to see what are the standards of corporate governance as a whole in this economy. Is it moving in the right direction or not? Now, at the end of the day, investors take risk, and it's calculated risk. And to me, part of that calculated risk is that Ukrainian institutions are going to continue to evolve under pressure from the expectations of investors.
Let's go to another question. You, sir, at the back there. Thank you.
My name is Kia Atri. I'm from BBC Monitoring Iran program. The question well, there are two questions really. First from Olena. You talked about thinking outside the box with regard to, I guess, accessing Russian frozen assets to finance reconstruction efforts. What does that look like? What does a thinking outside the box look like? And the second question is briefly, obviously the security establishment, the military is going to have quite a large role in a future Ukraine. And we know that with any kind of military involvement, there's always going to be bureaucracy, there's always going to be a lot of red tape. So if you want an investment environment where a conducive investment environment, you need to deregulate, you need to have less and less bureaucracy. How do you square the circle?
Okay, we have two questions there. Maybe we'll go to you, Elena, for the first one to say a little bit more about how using Russian assets for reconstruction works.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, unfortunately. But I think that the latest developments in this area are quite encouraging. And yesterday, I think the European Commission just proposed as one of the options how to do this. So basically, the option was to use, the proposal is to use Russia's frozen assets, invest them, so create a fund, a special fund, to put the assets into the fund, invest them, and use the proceeds to finance Ukraine's immediate reconstruction needs. And this immediate reconstruction needs has been estimated by the World Bank at $17 billion just for this year, for next year, for 2023. The second part of this proposal is to have these assets eventually returned to Russia after the peace agreement, but link the return to the peace agreement and make sure that the peace agreement includes reparations. So actually, these assets will just match the amount of money that Russia will be paying to Ukraine as reparations. Again, don't know how viable this proposal legally, but this is an example that actually things are moving in the right direction, and so the European community is already thinking out of the box.
Thank you. The other question was about the role of the security establishment, and I think we touched on this in the initial discussion as well. Any John Norisia, perhaps you'd like to?
I think it's an interesting question about the impact of war on society and politics in Ukraine, and what will that do to Ukraine? I mean, going into the war, you could see Ukraine very pluralistic society, very bottom up and horizontal, quite allergic to a concentration of power, any kind of autocratic tendencies immediately. And when they were the strong threat to Ukrainian democracy, met a very strong civic uprising that happened with the gradual frequency of every 10 years when there was a real threat. I actually don't think that military will in any way either capture the state. There could be securitization of politics, of course, if Ukraine will not resolve its security issue. But I actually don't think that the military will be in any way on the obstacle to deregulation or actually accepting European acquis that will be needed for Ukrainian membership in the European Union. Quite the opposite. I know a lot of, personal stories of soldiers who are fighting. They want to come back home and say, is corruption fixed? When are we member of the European Union? They have a quite liberal reformist agenda.
Yes, you in front, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Albanna. I just arrived yesterday from Istanbul. Thank you for the very interesting session. What I'm trying to say, it is very hard to talk about reconstruction at the time of war, at the time of global economical crisis, at the time that the British government does not have funds to pay for the rent of the Ukrainian who actually living in UK from March or April next year. It's something. Oh, sorry, there's something. One thing. This is something very optimistic, but actually I'm coming from a humanitarian background. It's 40 years since we started founding Islamic Relief 40 years ago in Birmingham. Why didn't we talk about peace and let our enemy, which we know his character as an individual, to feel that he has a false victory? And we use our soft powers. We're talking about hard power, economy, military, and all these big things, which is extremely expensive. And at the end of the day, nobody will pay for it for a longer term, and at the time of the economical crisis. And use our soft power. You are one of the soft power, isn't it? Education and others. Our Europe is very, very stronger, much stronger than Russia in this area. The last point, or the 1 or 2 points,
Can you move
is
to a question quickly, please?
my question is, where is the civil society presence in this meeting to try to bring the feeling of the local of the people of Ukraine, which actually Chatham House should have been more inclusive to bring them? I just stop there.
Okay, I think I'm going to pass to you, Mauricio, as the chair of the Ukraine Forum. I think you have an answer.
Their hands in the audience. Well, look around. These are all, yeah. So I think we have quite good representation of Ukrainian. And we brought you voices from Ukraine also in the way they see modernization. There's quite a lot of Ukrainians in the audience.
Hi, I'm Andrew from Alico. Just a question about, I guess, some of the money for reconstruction. And you spoke about donor expectations. Is there a challenge with maybe like Middle Eastern or Chinese money, and maybe less expectations than EU or Western investors have, like to be taken, etc.? Yeah, question.
That's a very interesting question. Who actually funds? Obviously, military effort is funded by the West, but President Zelensky mentioned that it's open to everybody. And we have to say, even when we look at Pakistan, China can build basically a road in 6 months. HS2, they are absolutely amazed. I'm for environmental standards, but the fast train lane, it's been 10, 15 years in the pipeline. we just cannot afford. We don't have this timeline. So there is a temptation to go for other donors with a track record of delivering very quickly. And I don't think that's the best way forward, because we know from our debate on globalization, China's investment comes with strings. And we really are talking about, integration into the Western market with Western standards. So there are some tough choices: efficiency, expediency versus actually long-term planning. And this is the issue of also, and John, going back to your big question, is it feasible? Is it too big to do architecture and a plan that let's better not try it and fail? Let's just do it on an ad hoc basis. For me, we need a plan, because we don't want to have a Montenegrin bridge road to nowhere. We need a plan that integrated and public infrastructure, schools, and we need to have, wouldn't like to say a long-term plan, but we need to have a platform. And from that point of view, it's very important. I can perhaps come back a bit later on the experience of the EU and Western donors rallying together around the project of decentralization. And it's a massive success, international Western success story. But I'll just come back to, I think what is interesting, the most important thing, China will find Ukraine if Ukraine attractive. If Ukraine is still corrupt, there are politicians you can go to and make deals. So I really hope that we'll have what I call securitization of the rule of law, basically, and the investment climate that becomes a matter of national security and not vested interest. And I think this is happening because the Ukrainian army, it's not just an army, it's an army of citizens. We have hundreds of thousands of people recruited into the army who are there because they have to. And they are basically a voice of reason and actually push for this securitization, because every public procurement which doesn't deliver on whatever is needed means fighting and winning is more difficult.
Good day, everyone. First of all, thank you, Chatham House, for raising this important issue, as it's vitally important to start reconstructed discussion at the beginning, and it takes time to create a real effective structure. So my question, I'm Natalia Katzer-Buchkovska, I'm founder of Ukrainian Sustainable Fund, and my question is the following. Are you thinking about the particular financial instruments which could boost investment even now into private sector, as war is still going on and we don't know when it will end. And we need to, and there is a wish of some companies, especially in energy, as energy is widely distracted and destroyed by Russian arms. And even some foreign companies want to go now and reconstruct now and rebuild now. They need some security. I mean, maybe some war bonds. They also ask about some trade finance, while other instruments like war insurance. Are you thinking about this, and to whom it should be proposed to boost and to accelerate this process?
Thank you. I think it's a great question. And I think that in a sense where we started was looking at the rationale for looking at reconstruction now, rather than looking at how does it happen once the war is ended. I think it's a crucial question here about reconstruction that actually has to happen now, in the sense that if there is going to be a successful emergence of Ukraine from the war, then certain things are not going to wait until the war is over. So what are the sectors do the panel think that that are really going to need special and urgent attention? And energy obviously mentioned as one of those. And what are the mechanisms by which the sort of capital required for successful remedial interventions at this stage can be mobilized?
Well, of this, of the options is it that you discussed that kind of give some protection to the investors who are willing to kind of to put money in Ukraine now. I think that the war insurance would be the most effective mechanism. So that from our experience, from experience of my company, we do have a lot of contacts with investors who are interested in investing in Ukraine, but after the security risk is substantially reduced. So if they're not ready to put their money in a project that could be kind of destroyed next day by the missile attack. So it's not, I think that, well, trade finance, like war board, that's all helpful, but what is critical now is to establish a kind of a mechanism that would protect investors from such incidences. Well, I know that some work has been done already in this area. There is a pilot project for $1 billion that's supposed to kind of start operational soon. But of course, like $1 billion in this environment is not a big amount. Maybe it makes sense if this pilot project is successful to really scale it up substantially and direct some of the financial support that Ukraine is receiving now into this kind of an insurance fund, and then there will be multiplicative impact on the economy.
Thank you. John, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just as a small sequel, I mean, aside from the energy sector, it seems to me that the agricultural sector is extremely important in Ukraine as a revenue earner, and of course, keeping the country fed and supplied, and indeed a contributor to global food security. There are reports that some agricultural companies have been actually struggling to agree terms with their creditors in this situation, and clearly the creditors, including some of the international financial institutions, need to show a degree of flexibility here to ensure these companies survive.
Think about it. Who is now the biggest investor to Ukrainian home front recovery? It's Ukrainian business, because 95% of Ukrainian companies actually support their employees. They support also the war effort. They donate, in addition to all their economic burdens and, personal traumas. They are actually investing in supporting Ukrainian home front. And I think what we would like to see in the composition of Ukrainian recovery finance is more grants and less credit. So far we are seeing more tendency towards subsidized credit, but we probably would need, while the war goes on, because there are different things, while the war goes on and when we will have an end to hostilities, some kind of microfinancial assistance to Ukrainian companies to keep employing people, to keep paying taxes, to keep economy going, similar to COVID assistance that companies were receiving in the West. Perhaps such programs should be financed through the World Bank. But in this moment of urgency, we need to ensure Ukrainian companies survive after many of them relocated and after, some are even opening. There are new restaurants opening in Kyiv when I was in September. So it was previous investment, they go for it. So there's incredible will to succeed in Ukrainian private sector.
Thank you.
If I just may add, the liquidity of Ukrainian banks is an extremely important issue here, because they know how to lend.
Ukrainian funds, but they're not lending because the interest rate is very high. So that's.
Think Tank Warsaw. I have a question on transformation of political sphere of this informal decision-making processes John spoke about. Capacity of society is remarkable, and it's really a driver for modernization and transformation. But political sphere, it's a question, it's an open question. We see that these functions are very deeply rooted. And even though Zelensky is a hero in many respects, we can see tendencies for power concentration, and many reforms only progress under great external pressure. Without that, they wouldn't progress. So what makes you think that the war will stop this kind of political culture and transform it finally? Or will it still be the struggle between the civic society and the government?
It's such a big question that I'll try and take it very briefly. I don't see it so much as a struggle between civil society and government. I see it as a struggle between different interest groups within the country. And for those elite groups who were able to establish this hold on the country's institutions, and be it through their representatives in government, parliament, the regulatory agencies and elsewhere, their grip, it seems to me, is going to loosen just because of the, I mean, partly the destruction that has been inflicted on Ukraine, that some of those financial industrial groups have suffered very badly. And I think they are very unlikely to re-emerge as they were before. So this is going to create space within the, in political life for different forces to emerge. Will there continue to be struggles between the interest groups? Will societies continue to have to fight to assert itself and its interests? Of course it will. And that's part of a normal part of political life. But I think we're probably going to see some reshaping of the political environment, which will then have a positive impact on the quality of the institutions.
That even under the circumstances of war and martial law, you still have a political discussion going on in Ukraine. You have a political opposition. I mean, Poroshenko's party is raising issues about the media reform, especially about kind of unified television program where not everybody gets equal access. But if you want, what happens now is the state takes over a role of a quite powerful entity. And if you look at the post-war Ukraine, you will need to de-state Ukraine from that influence. And the trend, which John showed in his research, and also shows that the role of oligarchs in economy is decreasing even before the war. Now, some numbers, for example, Akhmetov's holding, they've lost 28% of assets. Privat Bank lost 62% of assets. Firtash, 26% of assets. They are losing assets massively. It does not mean that once the state will release what it has nationalized, there will not be new groups emerging. But as I said, there's such vigilance in the society, there will be vigilance in the West, and there will be intolerance and also the need, a massive need for the state to deliver healthcare, rehabilitation, support to vulnerable groups, that it simply will not be able, I think, to run on the old system. Similar to like Russia cannot continue as it was before this invasion, similar Ukraine will have to change to succeed after this invasion.
Thank you. And those are very big questions. And in terms of actually helping Ukraine to succeed, that's important. The West has to do what it has to do in terms of actually focusing the mind. And what springs to mind that if we take Georgia after the short Russian-Georgian War of 2008, President Saakashvili actually ruled and made decisions about 20 people around them. To put it mildly, Ukraine is not Georgia. We cannot rely on this informal mechanism. But nevertheless, what was interesting that with such sort of focused resources, Georgia started basically screening assistance and being selective, and refusing certain projects which were not part of the actual sort of what was not needed. Ukraine needs capacity building. This cannot be done by informal sort of mechanism. War leadership is great, but inside the government, we need capacity building and we need political empowerment. And from that point of view, going back to this mechanism of sandwiching, that the West, when it comes to reconstruction, speaks with one voice. And when there are blockages, can actually go and say, so we have to have tough love and conditionality and sort of speaking with one voice, but also delivering hard messages when there are political and sort of rule of law blockages.
Okay, I've just been informed that lunch will be a little bit late. So that means just like in the World Cup, we have a number of minutes that can be added on. So gentlemen in the second row there, please.
Thank you, Bogdan Mihailu, Kyiv Post. Yeah, one of the great changes, quiet ones, is the de-oligarchization that's been going on. First, of the pro-Russian elements, Medvedchuk's channels, then Akhmetov giving up his TV channels, the political control. Subtle but very important changes that are taking place. Yes, media is being concentrated in a support the government, support the country effort, but there's still plenty of independent media, and that is very positive. I wanted to ask about another angle in capacity building. We're having a lot of training of military in Britain and elsewhere. is this not a time when we should be investing in training the political leaders of the future, bringing over young Ukrainians to universities, think tanks, and teaching them the ways of doing these things? Because we're short of skills in Ukraine. There's a lot of enthusiasm, but the political culture has never really been there of the sort that's needed. Thank you.
I think it's a great idea. Just want to.
And I think it's supported by the survey. As you've seen, a lot of Ukrainian organizations believe that capacity building of government officials to project manage, financially manage recovery, to be accountable, to be transparent is needed. Now, yeah, I agree. We need a boot camp for reconstruction warriors.
One more question, lady there with her hand up. That's the one.
Thank you. Maria Zolkina, research fellow at LSE and also representing Ukrainian think tank. My question is about actually the food security, because John has mentioned that it is extremely important for Ukrainian budget, which is true, to continue this so-called grain deal. But we have a problem right now because the plans for these supplies of the grain from Ukraine are really short ones, so just for 3 months. And simultaneously, Russia uses these negotiations to try to blackmail Ukraine through Turkey and UN. For instance, right now, we are facing the blackmailing regarding resumption of ammonia transit, which is both a security and another kind of threats to Ukraine. So do you have any ideas how, let's say, people who are specializing in economics can help diplomats to, let's say, enlarge our capacities when it comes to extending the grain deal without these blackmailing practices on the side of Russia?
Anyone want to have a go at that one?
The honest answer there is I have no idea how you do that. And the problem is that Russia has control of those Black Sea outlets, and it can prevent Ukraine exporting, through some of the key southern ports, not just Odessa. And so you're immediately, on the back foot. And to me, it was no surprise that Russia introduced the issue of fertilizer and ammonia exports. And clearly some ground was given. But these arrangements are very temporary. And as I understand it, some of the Ukrainian grain traders don't have confidence that this is going to last. And therefore, looking at alternative export routes, which are vastly more expensive. So it's highly unsatisfactory because this then feeds down to Ukrainian farmers who need to get a reasonable price for their product. So it's highly unsatisfactory.
And also this only covers grain, doesn't cover sunflower and other cereals, which is important part of Ukrainian export. Covers all of them. But also I think one example to, but also, I mean, just a footnote, it's also only in bulk, and not all exporters are transporting in bulk. So it limits, obviously, the capacity of producers, some producers, to export. And I think the good example was when Russia decided not to extend the deal and pull out of it, but Turkey stood the ground, and Ukraine and UN said, we will continue regardless of what you do. And then Russia kind of came back to the table. I think it's a good example also of, posturing and sending strong messages to Russians that they are not the only one to set the rules of the game in the Black Sea. And I think Turkey can play that role.
Great. I think we have time for one more very brief question. Man in the front row here. Oh, sorry, you lost it. You went there. Don't worry. Stay there.
Thank you. Lincoln from Black Peak and the FPC. So we touched a bit in Orisia's comments on, the political landscape and divisions still existing, but how are any political divisions at the moment playing out in terms of the debate about allocation of capital and reconstruction? Because you mentioned media reforms, but surely how that capital is going to get allocated after a war should be the subject of immense debate, given that these parties aren't otherwise all unified.
Quick answer, anyone?
The question itself, because I didn't hear it well. The question itself is how?
It's how the distribution of funds will be fairly, and how these different groups could get access to funds. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
So is reconstruction itself going to become a sort of political football, as it were?
Well, the risk is definitely there. And to be honest, I don't have an answer how it should be structured right at the moment. But that's why we have this broad discussion in different European cities about what would be the best way to do it.
Now, in the space of the next minute, this man to whom I promised a question, I'm going to give him the chance.
Vitaly Sizov, Ukrainian international broadcaster. Could I ask you comment again yesterday's statement of Ursula von der Leyen? Because I think in some sense it's ambiguous because she said that we take this money but don't know when Ukraine get it and how Ukraine get it. What do you think when Ukraine should get this frozen money of Russia? Thank you.
I think that there is a kind of when I think Ukraine should get, and I think it should get it now. So it's a very simple answer, but we should be realistic, right? So definitely there are many risks, kind of with respect to the Russian assets of the central bank reserve, the risk to financial markets also, yeah, because probably the other nations will not be willing to invest into US dollars or euros at the scale that they did before if these assets are confiscated. But the mechanism which has been proposed works as follows. So as long as we don't have a peace agreement, which would probably include reparations, so the money this $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves are put to work. Right? They're invested in something. And in current interest rate, it would be, I don't know, 5% per year. And return on this money would be absolutely reasonable. And this is already $15 billion per year, which is, well, it doesn't cover all Ukraine's needs, but it covers a lot of Ukraine's needs as long as war continues. So that's, I think, the idea behind this proposal.
Thanks, Elena. Quick word from Katarina.
Yes,
Very
I think
quick.
this session is, a session of competitive optimism in contrast to competitive pessimism in the previous session. So I'm trying to do my bidding. There is a lot talking about capacity, but I think we have to recognize that Ukraine would not be where it is if it didn't have the capacity already. It may be dispersed, not in the right place, but we have a new generation who are trying to displace the old ways of doing things. So I have no illusions about the oligarchs. They will try to recover and recapture assets, but we also have capacity. And from that point of view, small and medium basically enterprises, basically funding for them, this is a massive, massive opportunity. And I'm just thinking, I know the war, what we have is horrendous, but in 1994, I was asked by a budding journalist from The Economist, would Russia attack Ukraine? And I looked at him, in disbelief that this could be even a question. We would have been in an entirely different situation. So 30 years on, however bad and difficult, so many problems to answer, we're in a sort of vastly different situation. And it's just ensuring that state institutions can also now, live up to the challenges. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you to everyone on the panel. We will stop there on that upbeat note. My apologies for everyone who had a question that we didn't get to, but our time does in the end run out. But thank you for being such an active and learned audience. Thank you particularly to all the members of the panel. It's been a pleasure and an honor to work with you. My last thing I need to say to you is that lunch is going to take place in the Neil Malcolm room, and that the session will recommence at 13:30. Thank you very much.